They thought it was a trick. No country, no matter how rich, could afford to waste meat like that. Not in war, not in front of prisoners, and especially not in the middle of a Texas summer when the scent of beef fat sizzling over an open flame traveled farther than any propaganda. The first time Obergefreiter Wilhelm Kramer saw it, he didn't speak. He couldn't. A rancher, denim shirt soaked with sweat, cigarette tucked behind one ear, stood over a long iron grill, flipping steaks thicker than a Bible. Smoke rose into the sky like a flag, and the smell broke something in Wilhelm's chest. Back home, his younger brother's rations had run out. He'd written last month, asking Wilhelm if horses were still being slaughtered in the East. He hadn't answered. But here, in a prisoner camp, men were being served steak, not slop. Not powdered gruel, not thin soup with floating carrot skins. Steak, with salt, with real melted butter dripping over the char. He remembered gripping the edge of the wooden bench, watching the first plate being served, not to a guard, but to a prisoner. One of them. One of us. The American handed over the plate like it was nothing. No speech, no smile, just a nod. As if this weren't the middle of a war. As if they were equals. As if mercy came with mashed potatoes. Wilhelm didn't eat that day. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear, but from a question no training had prepared him for. What if everything they told us was wrong? And what Wilhelm didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that this was just the first course. What came next would break more than their hunger. The ship shouldn't have existed. That's what they whispered, huddled beneath canvas tents, boots still dusted with Texas soil, watching a film reel flicker against a makeshift screen. American guards had rolled it in like it was entertainment, just another evening distraction. But what played that night did something far stranger than distract. It dismantled belief. The footage was raw, grainy, loud, sparks flying, cranes swiveling, welding torches glowing white-hot. Then, a title card in bold, SS Robert E. Peary, launched in 4 days, 15 hours. Laughter rippled through the POWs at first. 4 days? A battleship? Lies. It had to be. But the film kept rolling. Time-lapse images showed steel skeletons rising hour by hour. Men in overalls moved like ants. Organized chaos. A hull took shape. Walls closed in. A smokestack rose. And then cranes groaned. Champagne shattered. And the vessel slid into the harbor like a metal ghost, barely 5 days after its first bolt was driven. Oberfeldwebel Dietrich Müller leaned forward, eyes squinting. He'd spent 6 months in Kiel overseeing submarine hull fabrication. 6 months for one boat. 6. And even then, delays were routine. Steel shortages, labor strikes, bombings. But here, in broad daylight, under no camouflage netting, in full view of the world, Americans were berthing ships faster than Germany could finish breakfast. He didn't say a word, but his fingers tapped the armrest in a rhythm he hadn't used since childhood. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Panic, the kind that wears a uniform. Later that night, someone in Barrack 3 muttered, "It's fake, clever editing." Another whispered, "Then why did the guard say there are 2 more launching tomorrow?" They didn't sleep much, and even as they tried to forget the film, the punchline kept echoing. If they can build a ship in 4 days, what else are they building? But that was just the beginning. They didn't believe the lights at first, not until night fell. At 1943, the guards made their final rounds. The sun dipped behind the mesquite trees. Crickets stirred. A hush settled over Camp Hearn, broken only by the sound of boots and the occasional clang of a tin cup. And then, like a scene from a dream none of them could have imagined, the bulbs blinked on. Not lanterns, not torches, not war lamps dripping kerosene. Electric light, rows of them, clean, bright, quiet. Suspended from overhead beams, the yellow glow poured down like theater light onto wooden floors, bunk beds, reading tables. It didn't flicker, it didn't hum, it just was. Wilhelm sat frozen on the edge of his cot, a worn copy of Goethe in his hands, pages untouched. A boy across the room, barely 19, whispered, "Why would they give us electricity?" No one answered. Because back home, entire districts in Hamburg had gone dark. Hospitals shared generators. Soldiers wrote letters under candles. And here, the enemy lit up a POW camp like a university dormitory. A lieutenant from the Luftwaffe finally stood up and unscrewed a bulb. He examined it, held it to his ear, licked his thumb and touched the edge. Foolish, but desperate to find the trick. There was none. These weren't illusions. They were wired in, stable. Like America had so much power to spare. Even its prisoners never had to sit in the dark. It felt insulting. But it also felt worse. It felt like proof. Proof of an enemy who didn't need to crush you to conquer you. Who simply showed you a life you couldn't have and let you crumble trying to explain why. And just when they thought they'd seen the extent of American excess, the doors to the mess hall creaked open. A smell drifted out. It wasn't soup, it was bread. Warm and white. They had never seen bread like that. Not even before the war. The slice on Wilhelm's tray was thick, almost an inch. Its surface gleamed under the electric light, soft and unmarred, crust barely golden. When he pressed a finger to it, the bread sprang back. No ash, no dust, no sawdust filler. Just warmth, white bread. In Germany, white bread was a memory, reserved for officers, or black market kings. What little remained was stale within hours, often padded with ground acorns or powdered potato. But here, in a prisoner of war camp, it was served fresh, daily. No one spoke at first. They just stared. A few men sniffed it. One broke off a corner and rubbed it between his fingers. Another leaned close and whispered, "They must be testing something, poison, or some kind of psychological trick." But then someone took a bite. A real bite, chewed, swallowed. Nothing happened, except maybe one thing. He smiled. That broke the spell. Suddenly, the room was alive. Spoons clinking, trays sliding, jaws moving in rhythm. No one asked why. They didn't dare. But inside, they knew something fundamental had shifted. Back home, children lined up for ration cards. Wives bartered boots for turnips. Soldiers fought over moldy loaves behind the front. And here, prisoners were served American wheat. Milled, baked, and trucked in, not for propaganda, but because that's what America did. It fed, even its enemies. And as Wilhelm watched a guard pass by with a second tray, this one with Coca-Cola on it, he almost dropped his spoon. They weren't done yet. The bottle hissed when opened, not like anything they'd heard before. This wasn't beer. This was sharper, crisper, like a snake exhaling. And the sound alone sent a ripple through the mess hall. Every head turned. The guard, a boy no more than 20, placed the sweating glass bottle gently onto the tray. It was dark, curved, familiar and foreign all at once. Etched in white script across the center, Coca-Cola. Wilhelm blinked. He'd seen the name before, once. In a contraband ad torn from Life magazine, passed between soldiers like a secret. They'd laughed at it. Sugar water for soft men. But now, here it was. Real. Cold. Beads of condensation sliding down its side like rain on a train window. The prisoner receiving it stared for a long moment. Then, almost sheepishly, he lifted the bottle to his lips, and drank, and paused. He didn't speak. Just let the fizz coat his tongue, eyes widening slightly, as if some part of him, carefully constructed, armored, trained, had quietly cracked. A few seconds later, someone asked, "What does it taste like?" The man lowered the bottle, looked at the others, and said, "Like surrender." Laughter followed, nervous, uneven, but no one denied it, because they all knew what Coca-Cola was. It wasn't just a drink, it was a world, a symbol of freedom, of indulgence, of some impossible dream rolling across highways in convertibles, not tanks. And here it was, in their hands. That night, more bottles arrived, served with burgers, on trays, in silence. And as one prisoner turned the empty bottle over in his hand, reading the small print near the base, "Bottled in Waco, Texas," he looked up and said quietly, "God help us. They live like this every day." They didn't know what to do with the napkins. At first, they thought it was a joke. Folded cloth, real linen, not paper, laid beside each tray, clean, pressed, smelling faintly of starch. One guard gestured wordlessly as if to say, "Use it." So they did. Awkwardly, self-consciously. Wilhelm dabbed at his mouth, unsure if he was imitating or obeying. Around him, the others sat at tables, not benches, tables, covered in red and white checkered cloth. The mess hall had been transformed. No barking, no orders, no trays slammed down. Just the clink of forks, murmurs, the sound of chewing. Someone had brought out a radio. American jazz filtered softly through the room. A trumpet wandered lazily across a smoky melody, playful and strange. It felt surreal, as if they'd been smuggled not just across oceans, but across dimensions. This wasn't a prison. This was dinner. And then came the moment none of them could explain. The steak, not just grilled, but flame-kissed, served medium rare, juice pooling beneath, fat rendered at the edges, seasoned with cracked pepper and sea salt. No cuts, no rationing, just full slabs, heavy and hot, landing on plates like ceremony. Wilhelm didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he picked up the knife and began to cut. Each slice trembled, not from hunger but from something deeper. Grief, maybe. Grief for a country that couldn't feed its own, for comrades who died with dry tongues and hollow bellies, for a war sold on glory but built on starvation. He took a bite, and for the first time since capture, he tasted not just food, but disbelief. A disbelief so complete it made him lean back and whisper, "If this is defeat, what was victory supposed to look like?" They thought the ice cream was a mistake, a logistical error, maybe meant for the officers, or the guards, or someone important passing through. But then the cart rolled in, pushed by a Texan cook with arms like tree trunks and a grin that didn't know how to hide, and the lid lifted. Frost curled upward. The cold reached them before the smell did. Vanilla. Rich. Creamy. Soft enough to scoop. Firm enough to hold its shape. Nestled in steel containers, packed over with dry ice and cloth. Someone behind Wilhelm gasped, a real, involuntary gasp, the kind you'd expect in a church, not a prison. He hadn't seen frozen dessert since 1941. Not in Berlin, not even in Paris. Ice cream had vanished like jazz and cinema and books that didn't serve the Reich. It was a relic of better times, softer times. Times that, to a German soldier at the edge of the world, now felt more myth than memory. But here, in Texas, it arrived on wheels. And it came with cones. Each prisoner stepped forward like a child. The cook didn't rush, didn't measure, just scooped, handed over, and winked like he was dealing out a winning hand. When Wilhelm's turn came, he hesitated. Then he reached out, The cone was warm, the cream cold. It dripped immediately. He licked it, startled by the sweetness. A guard passed him a napkin. Another handed him a second scoop. No words, just hospitality. Around him, grown men laughed for the first time in months. Not bitter laughs, not soldiers' gallows humor, just laughter. Because something in that sugar undid the machinery inside them, softened it. And in that moment, beneath a Texas sky that refused to go to war, a thought passed like a shadow through Wilhelm's mind. If they can send ice cream into the desert, what can't they do? They didn't expect the woman in the white coat, not in a camp, not walking freely, not smiling. She entered the infirmary just after dawn, carrying a clipboard and a stethoscope. No guard escorted her, no weapon in sight. She greeted the medic, a wiry man named Joe from Oklahoma, with a nod, then turned to the line of POWs waiting on the bench like schoolboys after recess. "Next," she said. The name tag read, Dr. Evelyn Carter. Wilhelm hesitated. He was second in line. A toothache that had pulsed for weeks now throbbed like a drum. In Germany, he'd have waited months. Here, he waited 10 minutes. When it was his turn, she didn't flinch. Didn't speak German either, just smiled, gestured for him to sit and put on her gloves. Clean. Latex. He watched her wash her hands twice, checked the expiration date on the penicillin bottle 3 times. This wasn't improvisation, this was protocol. He opened his mouth. She examined, probed, nodded once, wrote something down, then turned to Joe and said, "We'll need to pull it, but I want to try a nerve block first. I don't want him in pain." Joe nodded. "We got plenty." Plenty. Back home, morphine was reserved for SS officers. Civilians bit down on belts. Some died from infection before they ever saw a syringe. Wilhelm stared at the vial of Novocaine and then at her hands. They didn't shake. She treated him like a person, not a prisoner, not a Nazi, not a number, just a man with a toothache. And as the numbness spread across his jaw, dulling the pain that had followed him across continents, he closed his eyes and thought, this isn't just mercy. This is something else. Something dangerous. Because mercy, he could explain. But dignity? That was treason. They thought it was a rumor. A cruel one. Someone in Barrack 6 had whispered it. That a prisoner named Franz, a former teacher from Leipzig, had been invited to give a lecture to Americans at a local school. Impossible, Wilhelm muttered. They would never let a POW near children. But a week later, the guards called his name. Not for punishment, not for labor, for interpretation. Franz stood in a borrowed shirt and slacks, not a uniform, at the front of a sunlit classroom in a rural Texas town. Chalk in hand, blackboard behind him. Before him, 24 American high school students, wide-eyed and respectful. His topic? German poetry, not propaganda, not ideology. Just Heine, Rilke, Goethe, the rhythm of language, the sound of sorrow, the weight of beauty. Wilhelm watched from the corner. The students listened, took notes. One girl even raised her hand and asked, "Do you miss home?" Franz paused, then smiled. "I miss the trees." Afterward, the principal shook his hand. The teacher thanked him. The students clapped. It wasn't staged. There were no cameras. Just genuine respect for knowledge, even when it came from a man wearing enemy shoes. And when they returned to camp, Franz didn't boast. He just sat quietly on his bunk, holding a small notebook the teacher had given him. On the first page, a student had written, "Thank you, Mr. Franz. I hope the war ends soon, not just for us, but for you too." That night Wilhelm lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the echo of chalk against board still in his ears. What kind of nation sends its children to learn from their enemies? What kind of war lets that happen? And if that wasn't strange enough, the next morning a priest came and asked who wanted to pray. They expected interrogations. They got sermons. The chapel was nothing more than a converted barrack. Wooden slats, open rafters, two fans creaking overhead. But when the door opened that Sunday morning, what entered wasn't a soldier or a spy. It was a priest, collar white, Bible worn, eyes soft from having seen too much, and still believing anyway. Wilhelm watched as a few men stood, then a few more, until nearly a third of the camp had filed into that room, boots scuffing, shirts pressed, eyes lowered not in shame, but in reverence. The priest didn't preach nationalism, didn't quote Roosevelt or Churchill. He read Psalm 137 in English, then in German. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? No one spoke. But in that moment, the words hit harder than any broadcast from Berlin. Wilhelm hadn't prayed in years, not since his mother's funeral, not since faith became optional. But as the priest bowed his head and invited silence, something cracked open. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a slow, painful awareness. He was being given permission to mourn, to regret, to hope, even here, even now. After the service, the priest stayed, sat with them, listened. One prisoner confessed his guilt. Another asked for news of his family. One simply cried and was handed a handkerchief, not from the guards, but from a fellow prisoner who used to believe in the fatherland more than God. Outside, the American flag flapped in the wind. Inside, forgiveness flickered, quiet, tentative, unsure of itself. And as Wilhelm walked back to his bunk, he thought about the priest's final words. The war can take your body. Don't let it take your soul. And he wondered, what if it already had? They thought the cargo ship was a decoy. No guns, no escorts. Just a fat gray hull slicing through the Gulf like it had nothing to fear. From the guard tower, Wilhelm squinted through borrowed binoculars. A Liberty ship, that much was obvious. He recognized the silhouette now after weeks of silent obsession. But something was wrong. It was moving too, smoothly. There were no radio towers, no signal flares, no zigzag maneuvering to avoid U-boats. Just a steady, confident course, like it was dancing through a war zone without ever hearing the music. Then the guard beside him muttered, "That one's got radar." Wilhelm froze. "Impossible," he said. But the American didn't argue, just handed him the field manual tucked in his back pocket. Inside, diagrams, charts, antenna arrays mounted on merchant ships, explaining how radar allowed even civilian convoys to detect submarines before they surfaced, how they could change course in the night, before the torpedo ever touched water. Wilhelm flipped through the pages with growing dread. Radar wasn't new. Germany had it. But not like this. Not on civilian vessels. Not mass-installed. Not working with pinpoint accuracy across thousands of miles of open ocean. Not casual. That was the part that scared him most. It wasn't just that the Americans had radar. It was that they gave it to ships carrying flour and chewing gum, like it was no big secret, like they could afford to lose it. He leaned on the railing, watching the Liberty ship vanish into the horizon, a steel ghost that could see in the dark. Behind him, the guard lit a cigarette and said, almost offhand, "That one's headed to England, carrying chocolate bars and typewriters." And Wilhelm whispered, almost to himself, "They're not fighting to survive. They're fighting to win." They thought the explosion was a fluke. A shell burst overhead, too high, too wide, yet still, the convoy scattered like ants. Dust rose, men ducked. One soldier shouted that it was just a warning shot. But then another shell came, It didn't hit the ground. It detonated mid-air, perfectly timed, right above the marching column. The sound was sharper, cleaner, and when the smoke cleared, the crater wasn't on the earth. It was inside the silence that followed. Wilhelm had seen artillery his whole life. He could predict the arc, the delay, the point of impact. But this was unnatural, as if the shell had a mind of its own, as if it knew where the lungs and hearts were, not just boots and soil. Later, in the rec room, a pamphlet passed from hand to hand, smuggled in maybe, or left behind by accident, though Wilhelm doubted Americans did much by accident. The title read, Proximity Fuse, the Science Behind Precision Detonation. He read it once, then again. A micro-radar inside the shell, it sensed distance to target, adjusted detonation in flight, exploded just above human heads where the shrapnel could do the most damage. No timer, no guesswork, just physics and ruthlessness. Germany had nothing like this. Not yet. Their brightest minds were building rockets to reach London. But here, the Americans were perfecting ways to drop steel rain with godlike precision. Wilhelm looked around at the others. They weren't scoffing. They weren't debating. They were scared. Because this wasn't just about better weapons. It was about something more chilling. The Americans weren't improvising. They were engineering. And somewhere deep in Wilhelm's chest, a quiet certainty began to form. If they're this far ahead, maybe we were never in the lead at all. They thought the sky was safe. That was the lie they held on to, even after the surrender in Africa, even after the long train ride through cotton fields and cattle country. Even when the steak and Coca-Cola started to blur the edges of the war, there was still one belief they clung to. At least in the air, we were equals. Wilhelm had served alongside Luftwaffe pilots, men with ice in their veins and iron in their bones. They spoke of dogfights over the channel with reverence. They told stories of skill, not numbers, of machines, not mass. But then came the airfield. It was a Sunday trip. Bizarrely offered as a form of morale, a reward for good behavior. A handful of POWs were driven out to an auxiliary base outside Waco to help stack supplies. Harmless, the Americans said. Routine. What they saw was anything but. Rows of P-47 Thunderbolts and B-17 bombers stretched farther than the eye could see. Not hidden, not camouflaged, just sitting there, gleaming under the Texas sun like idle giants waiting for orders. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was the radar-guided trucks moving between hangars, the colored flags marking sorties for the next week, and the young mechanics, teenagers, walking around with clipboards, chewing gum, laughing as they calibrated bomb sites that Germany hadn't even reverse-engineered yet. One American sergeant saw Wilhelm staring at the long metal barrels stacked near the runway. Proximity-guided, he said, like one might say pepperoni or iced tea. Then he winked. We don't miss twice anymore. Wilhelm turned away, because in that moment he knew the sky wasn't equal. Not anymore. The war Germany was fighting, the one they thought was close, had already been lost. In laboratories, in factories, in classrooms, in places where American boys learned how to break the future before German men even imagined it. That night, back in camp, no one spoke. Even the stars felt different, like they didn't belong to the same war anymore. They thought they knew sacrifice. They'd seen blood, hunger, frostbite, the hollowed faces of comrades buried without names. They carried the weight of death in their boots, every step a memory, every silence a grave. But nothing prepared them for the moment the Americans burned their own fuel. It was just past dusk when the trucks rolled in, massive, silver-bellied, marked with U.S. Army stencils. They parked near the edge of the camp perimeter, not far from the livestock pens. No guards shouted, no alarms blared, just calm movement, as if this were part of the schedule. Then a match was struck, and the flame met gasoline. A tower of fire screamed into the sky. 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel, ignited, on purpose. Not because they were under attack, not because the tanks were leaking, but because the convoy was retreating and the Americans refused to leave anything behind. Wilhelm watched from the fence line. The fire roared like a dying god. Orange turned to white. Heat warped the air. Even from yards away, it seared the face. He shielded his eyes and squinted through the shimmer. It wasn't waste, it was calculation. They'd rather destroy abundance than let the enemy touch it. In Germany, they scraped mold from bread. Here, they incinerated oceans of fuel, casually, efficiently, without ceremony. A young guard standing nearby, maybe 19, glanced at Wilhelm and said, "We don't lose things. We choose not to give them away." He smiled, then walked off. That smile would haunt Wilhelm, because it wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking, it was confident, pitying, like a farmer might look at a hungry wolf who doesn't understand what fences really mean. And as the flames crackled into the night, turning black into blue, Wilhelm whispered, "They fight with fire, not just to win, but to prove they can afford to." They thought pride was unshakable. It was all they had left. Uniforms had been stripped, ranks dissolved. But deep down, beneath the fatigue and rationed smiles, they still clung to one thing, the belief that German will was harder than steel, that Americans, for all their comforts, all their noise and sugar and soft ways, didn't understand what it meant to endure. Then came the factory visit. It was meant to humiliate, perhaps, a field trip into the belly of their captor's war machine. Wilhelm and 20 others were driven to a Ford plant on the edge of town, wide as a city, loud as thunder, alive with motion. The first shock hit before they stepped out. From the parking lot, they watched as a brand-new aircraft rolled off the line. Time elapsed? 63 minutes, from bolt to bomber, from frame to flight. Every 57 minutes, another followed. Inside, conveyor belts moved like arteries, workers gliding alongside wings and fuselages, plugging in parts like clockwork. No yelling, no panic, just rhythm. A choreography of machines and men and women dressed in denim and leather, their hands moving with precision born not of fear, but of belief. Wilhelm stood beside a woman no older than his sister, grease on her cheek, welding torch in her grip. She didn't flinch as sparks flew, didn't look up as a B-24 rolled past, its engine still warm from the first ignition. This wasn't just labor, it was devotion. Not to a man, not to a party, but to a system that worked. A system that didn't need slogans to build wings. And in that moment, something shattered. Because for all the propaganda he'd swallowed about weak Americans, about decadence, about softness, here was proof that efficiency could be gentle and strength could be quiet. When they returned to camp, no one spoke. The silence wasn't from fear, it was from awe. And as Wilhelm lay on his bunk, hands black with factory dust, he looked at the ceiling and thought, if they can build a bomber in an hour, what will they build in peace? They thought they understood surrender. It had been drilled into them. Lines in sand, hands raised, weapons dropped, a gesture, a transaction, a moment. But what they witnessed next wasn't a surrender of arms. It was the quiet surrender of certainty. It began with the boots. A shipment arrived at the camp, new work gear for the POWs assigned to help on nearby farms. But these weren't standard issue. They were leather, thick, high-ankled, American-made, lined with fleece. Some still carried tags. A few prisoners laughed bitterly. They thought it was a mistake, maybe stolen, maybe overstock the U.S. Army didn't want. Until the rancher arrived, tall, weathered, holding a clipboard and a hat like it was part of his skin. He looked at the prisoners, pointed at the boots, and said, "Can't have y'all freezing in the fields." Simple as that. No scolding, no bargaining, just concern. As if their comfort mattered. As if enemy soldiers deserved to be warm. The boots fit well. Too well. Better than anything Wilhelm had worn in years. He walked in them and felt a betrayal in his soles. Because the ground didn't bite, the cold didn't seep, and every step forward felt less German. Then came the jackets, then the gloves. Then a hot thermos of coffee passed down the line from one prisoner to the next by a teenage farm girl no older than his niece. She smiled at Wilhelm. He forgot to smile back, because something deeper than discomfort was settling in. A new kind of fear. The kind that didn't come from punishment or hunger, but from kindness he couldn't explain. That night, a man named Klaus, once a fire-breathing officer from Bremen, folded his uniform one last time, laid it at the foot of his bunk, sat down in silence. When asked why, he simply said, "Because it means nothing here." They thought silence was strength. In the camps, it had become a currency. The fewer words you used, the less you revealed. Stoicism was armor. Wilhelm wore it well. So did Klaus. So did dozens of men who once shouted "Sieg Heil" and now mumbled only when spoken to. But silence had begun to rot. It started with a letter, delivered in the midday sun, tucked inside a brown envelope. A Red Cross courier handed it to Wilhelm with a nod. The return address read Dresden, but not in his father's hand. It was written by his younger sister. Inside were 3 pages. No pleasantries, just ash. She wrote of February, of a sky that screamed fire, of neighbors turned to dust, of bodies stacked like lumber near the Elbe. She had survived. Their parents had not. The house was gone. The dog was gone. The bakery that had stood for 3 generations was now melted glass and stone. Wilhelm sat on the edge of his bunk, read it once, then again, then folded it precisely, as if discipline might hold back grief. It didn't. That night he walked past the mess hall, past the fence, to the far end of the camp, where the guards let prisoners walk under watch. He stood by the fence post, hands buried in the borrowed coat, and watched the ranch lights flicker in the distance. Warm homes, laughing children, an untouched sky, and something inside him collapsed. Not loudly, just, finally. He sat in the dirt and wept, not for his father, not for Dresden, but for a truth he could no longer fight. We started this. Not the fire, but the lie. The one that said they were better, chosen, superior. The one that made ash seem noble. And as the wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of hay and distant cattle, Wilhelm whispered what no officer, no propaganda, no training had prepared him to say, "They're not the enemy." And in that moment, he no longer knew who was. They thought learning English was betrayal. At first, it was subtle. A word here. A phrase there. Picked up from a guard's command, a label on a soup can, a line from a movie played in the rec room. Careful. Come here. One more. The POWs repeated them under their breath like forbidden hymns, not knowing why they stuck, only that they did. But then someone asked for a dictionary. It happened on a Tuesday. Wilhelm remembered the chill in the air, the way the light slanted through the barracks, painting everything gold. A young man named Becker, 20, bookish, once a fervent Hitlerjugend, stood up during roll call and quietly asked the camp clerk if there were any English grammar books available. The room fell silent. No one mocked him. No one moved. But something shifted. That afternoon, Becker sat alone by the window, flipping through a worn paperback titled American Phrases and Idioms. He sounded out the words softly, pencil in hand. "How are you?" His voice trembled, but his eyes didn't. Wilhelm watched from across the room. Later, someone handed Becker an old Mark Twain novel. Another brought a pencil sharpener. A guard offered to help him with pronunciation. By Friday, 4 men were learning. By the next week, 12. Not by order, not by rebellion, but by necessity. Because the war was ending and the future no longer spoke German. One night Wilhelm found himself muttering in the dark, "Thank you, please, I'm sorry." The words felt strange in his mouth, rounder, less rigid than commands, more human. And in that moment, he understood. It wasn't betrayal, it was release. From indoctrination, from slogans, from a language that had only taught him how to shout, but never how to ask. And as he turned out the light, a thought surfaced, soft, terrifying, and undeniable. Maybe we were never taught how to be free. They thought the worst shame was defeat, but it wasn't. It was realizing you had once cheered for the wrong flag, not because you were forced to, but because you believed it was right. That moment came for Klaus in the most ordinary way. He was sweeping the floor of the mess hall as he did every afternoon. Head down, movements precise. The camp was quiet that day, no shipments, no drills. Just the hum of a ceiling fan and the soft scrape of bristles against wood. Then someone dropped a tray. A loud clang. Milk spilled. A plate spun across the floor. Wilhelm turned just in time to see Klaus freeze, not because of the noise, but because a young black American soldier had rushed forward, not to scold, not to mock, not to report, but to help. He knelt, picked up the plate, said something about butterfingers, smiled, and Klaus flinched. Because in his world, in the world he'd been raised to defend, that boy wasn't supposed to be human. He wasn't supposed to smile. He wasn't supposed to matter. But here he was, wearing the uniform of the winning side, helping a prisoner of war clean up spilled milk. The shame didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It crept in slowly, like a bruise you didn't notice until someone touched it. That night, Klaus didn't eat. He sat alone on the bunk, staring at his hands. When Wilhelm passed by, he asked, "Are you all right?" Klaus didn't look up. He just whispered, "I told my son that the Reich would save the world." Then silence. A silence so heavy it made the entire barrack hold its breath. Because in that one sentence, every lie folded in on itself, every speech, every parade, every oath, crushed, and in its place, a new truth bloomed. The war wasn't lost in battle. It was lost the moment we forgot how to see. They thought time would harden them, that the longer they stayed, the easier it would be to forget, that they could build walls inside their minds, walls no steak, no Coca-Cola, no books, or kindness could breach. But time, it turned out, didn't harden, it hollowed. And in that hollow space, something else began to echo. It happened one evening as the sun folded itself behind the horizon in long golden sheets. The camp quieted. Somewhere beyond the fence, a harmonica played a tune Wilhelm didn't recognize. Soft, aching, full of something like longing. He was sitting on a bench near the garden, flipping through an English reader someone had left behind. The word on the page was mercy, not pity, not weakness, not surrender, mercy. Across the yard, 2 POWs were teaching each other to throw a baseball. One guard leaned against a post, yawning. Another was playing chess with an Italian prisoner, their match chalked out on a crate. Somewhere behind the barracks, someone was singing, low and off-key, an American folk song. And then Wilhelm saw something that unraveled him. A young prisoner, Otto, barely 19, knelt beside an injured bird. It had crashed into the fencing wire and lay there twitching. Otto didn't call for help. He didn't shoo it away. He simply cupped it in his hands, whispered something, and sat quietly while the tiny creature stilled. Then gently, he buried it beneath the wildflowers near the latrines. No ceremony, just care. Wilhelm turned his eyes back to the page. His throat tightened. Because mercy, he now understood, wasn't something you gave when you'd won. It was something you gave because you had been broken and chose not to break someone else. That night, he wrote a letter, his first since Dresden. It began with 6 words. I no longer know who I was. He folded it, did not seal it, did not send it, just placed it beneath his pillow like a confession not ready to leave the room. And in the darkness, with the harmonica fading and the smell of earth on the breeze, he whispered, not in German, but in the slow, halting syllables of a language that no longer felt foreign. Thank you for showing me. The war inside me is over. The train was late. No one complained. They stood quietly on the platform, former prisoners in second-hand coats, satchels slung over their shoulders, tags pinned to their collars like children heading to school. No shackles, no guards with rifles. Just a clipboard, a head count, and the faint scent of cinnamon rolls from the station cafe. Wilhelm sat on a bench near the far end, his boots scuffed, his hands folded around a letter he hadn't sent. Around him, the men were different now. Not because their uniforms were gone, but because their certainties were. Klaus no longer spoke of Reich victories. Becker carried an English dictionary like a Bible. Franz, the teacher, held a copy of Walt Whitman. And Otto watched the sky like it might forgive him if he stared long enough. A whistle cut through the cold. The engine emerged through the trees, sleek and silver. Too modern to be real. Wilhelm stood slowly, bones aching from a piece that had arrived too late and too gently. As the train groaned to a stop, a breeze lifted the hem of his coat, and he felt something fall from the inner pocket. He bent to retrieve it, a napkin, from that steak dinner months ago, still folded, still faintly stained with butter. He laughed, quiet, disbelieving, and tucked it back inside. Across the tracks, a child waved. American, maybe 8, maybe 9. She wore braids and clutched a small flag, not with nationalism, but innocence. She didn't know who they were, didn't care. She just waved, like children do. Wilhelm waved back. The conductor called boarding. As the men filed onto the train, he turned once more, not to salute, not to memorize the camp, but to look at the hills, the soil. The land that had done what bullets couldn't. It had humbled them, not with force, but with decency. As the train pulled away, someone tapped Wilhelm's shoulder and asked, "What will you do when you get home?" He thought for a long moment, then said in English, "Not forget." The wheels clattered into rhythm, smoke rose, Texas disappeared behind them. But somewhere deep inside, Wilhelm knew they came as soldiers. They left as witnesses. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. There was still one thing they had never been allowed to see. But that would come next time.